I stand here today
on an island in the middle of the mighty Mississippi,
clear-eyed about the fight ahead.
to declare
these words.
that
I am a candidate for president.
I'm running for president of the United States of America.
President of the United States.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope that this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners, and I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. For the next few weeks, we're going to be in a series that focuses specifically on the 2020 presidential candidates. Each episode will detail the candidate's personal and political life, all with the hope of helping to inform our listeners and beyond on each of the candidates. By promoting insight into each of these people, our hope is that each voter is able to make educated, well-informed decisions on who they'll cast their ballot for in the next presidential election. I also want to encourage you to seek out other outlets like my own to have a wider grasp on who these individuals are and what they bring to the table for you and your loved ones, because we all know that everyone has implicit biases, including myself. Each episode will, of course, highlight our own personal thoughts concerning the candidates, what the country needs moving forward, and how this person could potentially impact our society holistically. Lastly, I want to point out that we've chosen to highlight each candidate in alphabetical order instead of choosing who may or may not be a favorite of our own, in order to remain conscious of how our own implicit bias can affect how the episodes are previewed. With that, this episode is going to focus on Democratic presidential candidate Cory Booker.
In America, we have a common pain, but what we're lacking is a sense of common purpose.
What's up? Amen.
I grew up knowing that the only way we can make change is when people come together. When I was a baby, my parents tried to move us into a neighborhood with great public schools, but realtors wouldn't sell us a home because of the color of our skin. A group of white lawyers who had watched the courage of civil rights activists were inspired to help Black families in their own community, including mine. And they changed the course of my entire life. Because in America, courage is contagious. My dad told me, boy, never forget where you came from or how many people had to sacrifice to get you where you are. So over 20 years ago, I moved into the Central Ward of Newark to fight slumlords and help families stay in their homes. I still live there today, and I'm the only senator who goes home to a low-income inner-city community, the first community that took a chance on me. We are better when we help each other. The history of our nation is defined by collective action, by interwoven destinies of slaves and abolitionists, of those born here and those who chose America as home, those who took up arms to defend our country, and those who linked arms to challenge and change it. I believe that we can build a country where no one is forgotten, no one is left behind, where parents can put food on the table, where there are good-paying jobs with good benefits in every neighborhood, where our criminal justice system keeps us safe instead of shuffling more children into cages and coffins, where we see the faces of our leaders on television and feel pride, not shame. It is not a matter of can we. It's a matter of do we have the collective will, the American will. I believe we do. Together, we will channel our common pain back into our common purpose. Together, America, we will rise. I'm Cory Booker, and I'm running for President of the United States of America.
Booker currently serves as a senator from New Jersey and has been doing so for the past 5 years. Before serving as senator, Booker was the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and a member of the city council. Growing up, he lived in Washington, D.C. before moving to New Jersey and was a standout high school athlete. Because of that, after graduating high school, he enrolled in Stanford, where he continued his athletic career as well as received his bachelor's in political science. It wasn't enough for him to gain one prestigious degree, because after he finished at Stanford, he enrolled in the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and graduated with honors from there. He then finished his academic career by earning his Juris Doctorate degree from Yale Law. His childhood is particularly unique, being that his parents were among the first Black executives at IBM. After their corporate careers, they became active civil rights activists. Although his parents did work hard to provide a life that ultimately shielded their sons from societal issues surrounding them, they did ensure that he was aware of what was going on in order to prompt them to choose careers that would help make a difference. He was able to begin his political career quickly after finishing his law degree by winning a seat on the city council back in New Jersey, which he served for a few years before taking his first shot at mayor in 2002. He was unsuccessful in his first attempt at mayor, but came back 4 years later and won the position by a landslide and ended up serving for 7 years. Before he was successful in his second attempt at mayor, he devoted himself to helping establish nonprofit organizations that provided for Newark residents with more resources. As mayor, he was the third consecutive Black person to be in that position since the 1970s. He implemented reforms that improved city services, fixed the city's structural financial deficit, helped reduce the crime rate significantly by even going as far to patrol streets until 4 a.m. in his first term as mayor. He was able to approve pay cuts for top-earning city managers and directors, which is a good thing because the pay scale should be balanced, especially since those crucial dollars were needed to help impoverished areas. And he even reduced his own salary by 8%. His actions earned him the title of Super Mayor by all of his policy changes and interactions with the community. He saved a woman from a fire, literally, and went so far as to shovel an elderly man's driveway after responding to his daughter via Twitter. While all of these achievements are admirable, no one can take that away, one should definitely note that during his time as mayor, he joined Betsy DeVos on the board of Alliance of School Choice. His advocacy for school choice put him in hot water with the Newark Teachers Union, who opposed his 2010 re-election. Booker sought to look for alternatives to the traditional public school system where some inner-city students were struggling. These efforts were opposed by teacher unions who denounced the exit of taxpayer dollars from public schools. While some of that money would go to public charter schools, which could operate under different rules than traditional public schools, other taxpayer funds would be spent on tuition at religious and private schools and for-profit charters, which have problems in and of themselves, and you can learn about them on the education episode we did a while back. Or you can just DM me on Twitter or Instagram because I have a lot of thoughts about them. Now, fast forward to the confirmation hearing of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. Booker voted no on her confirmation, citing that her answers were problematic, unsatisfactory, and violated of what he believes a person in that position should do. His vote no surprised former union members that went against his re-election as mayor, which claimed that he's always been a proponent of school choice and never recognized him as a supporter of traditional public schools. His allies were thoroughly disappointed in his vote, claiming that he had turned into a partisan political player, which I can agree to some extent. His influence earned him a $100 million donation to the city's education fund from Mark Zuckerberg himself, appearances on Oprah, which then prompted to his eventual Senate run. His donation fund from Zuckerberg, however, sparked a lot of criticism. While his donation helped support a new teacher's contract in the city, it closed under-enrolled schools and opened new charters, which, like I said, I find myself highly problematic in regards to the closing of under-enrolled schools. Instead of closing them altogether, we should look at the structural impact that caused them to even need to be closed in the first place. Were there enough high-quality resources in terms of special services, smaller classes, qualified teachers, things like that? Well, more than likely not. However, that could have changed if money was allocated to these areas. These closings of schools more than likely interrupted the already disadvantaged educational path these students were on. Zuckerberg's donation isn't the first big corporate sponsor that caught Booker's attention in regards to school policy either. Wall Street donors helped fund the Democrats for Education Reform group that promoted charters and school choice, and Booker served on the advisory board for the group. He also gave a speech to the American Federation for Children, a group formerly led by Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos that specifically supports vouchers, in which he said that many children, by law, are locked into schools that fail their genius. Well, that's because the state fails them anyways. Lastly, he co-founded a group, Excellent Education for Everyone, that backed charters and vouchers in New Jersey, but fell short of its goals. For me, as a current educator and someone who wants to work in policy, I find Booker's decision-making regarding the education system highly problematic and honestly a failure altogether. While, yes, he did vote no on DeVos's confirmation, which is a good thing. However, to make those corrections for his specific city and state is a major shortcoming on his part, as well as other public officials. Booker is also no stranger to Silicon Valley donations as well, which could come back to haunt him during his run, seeing as how now him alongside his constituents are campaigning on grassroots campaigns with no corporate money donors. However, during his Senate tenure, he collected $500,000 from the internet industry, LinkedIn, Google, Emerson Collective, and early Facebook founder Sean Parker. During the 2014 election cycle, Booker received $1.87 million from the securities and investment industry, which made him the top recipient of Wall Street money. However, being that in this race he's recommending that all candidates shy away from corporate money, him not taking any corporate money may be the current reason he's short of the Democratic donor threshold to qualify for debates. While he's only merely 1,971 donors away from meeting the 65,000 contributors required for the convention, it's paramount to point out that while he may have decided not to remain in bed with corporate lenders, it's clear that everyday Americans still aren't buying his reformed look. They also aren't buying it because since Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner collected $41,000 worth of donations at their own personal home in 2013. While it was obviously 6 years ago, and Booker did say that he wouldn't take a dime from them now, he wanted to point out that Kushner and Trump were at one time progressive Democrats, which is why he doesn't regret fundraising with them. That's some tea. You should also know that he has received more campaign funds from the drug industry than any other lawmaker has. Coined the big pharma candidate, Booker is constantly reminded from the voters that being cozy with these big drug companies that skyrocket their prices for basic human medical needs like insulin will not favor him when it comes to the polls. He's also been accused of being a grandstanding politician, especially when he had an I am Spartacus moment by threatening to give up his Senate seat if the confidential documents during Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing weren't released. While I personally found that admirable, being that politicians and cultural icons have long put their own self-interest at the forefront instead of the interests of the American people. Now, in this particular race, his stances on the issues ranging from Medicare for all the Green Deal, reforming the criminal justice system, a new Voting Rights Act, legalizing marijuana, a proposal for a job guarantees plan, and a baby bonds plan, which would give newborns $1,000 in their own personal saving accounts to close the racial wealth gap. While his plans now do reflect that of progressivism, his past is clearly catching up with him, being that his polling numbers aren't the best in comparison to other big names. He hasn't reached the donor threshold for debate eligibility, and holistically, voters are still deciding whether or not Booker is the ultimate right candidate for them.
So, as we said, you're one of 20. I think it's fair to say a number of voters out there are overwhelmed. They're trying to understand how is one candidate different from another. As they look at you, how do they think Cory Booker is different from any of the other candidates?
Well, I think there's two things that distinguish me. One is just a very different career than the others in the race. I was a chief executive of my state's largest city through a crisis, and we actually created probably one of the best city comebacks in a decade, a city known for crime and corruption, now going through its biggest expansion economically. It's going through its biggest transformation of its school system and more. And then on top of that, I am a United States Senator that has a reputation in Washington for getting things done. In fact, the only piece of major bipartisan legislation that passed under this president was legislation I led in the Senate on the Democratic side with Dick Durbin for criminal justice reform. So getting things done in two different environments, as a chief executive and as a legislature, I think points to what kind of leader I'll be. But then the last thing is really important. I think there's a lot of folks who believe that this is a time that Democrats have to fight fire with fire. As a guy who ran a fire department, that's not a really good strategy. Democrats need to define themselves not what they're against or who they're against, but we've got to define ourselves what we're for. And this is a time where our nation needs a revival of civic grace, and it needs us to call us to our higher angels, not the low road of fighting Donald Trump on his own turf and his own terms.
Well, speaking of what you are for, one of the things you've talked about in what you're calling your Justice for All tour is expanding the earned income tax credit. This is something that was originally conceived to help the working poor. You're talking about greatly expanding it so that couples earning as much as $90,000 a year would be eligible. The question is, it would cost $2.5 trillion over a period of years. Are you undermining the original purpose of it, which is to help the working poor?
Well, I don't think so. I think families often making dual income, people making under $90,000 a year, are feeling the squeeze as the cost of everything is going up, from prescription drugs to child care. We have this nation now where baby boomers, 95% of them did better than their parents. For millennials, it's now down to 50%. We have a nation that could see the first generation not to do better than the one before. And a lot of that is because we're at a time of corporate profits are at 85-year high, but wages are about a 60-year low. And instead of this bank shot of sending tax cuts like we just did, blowing trillions of dollars of holes in our deficits, and thinking that somehow that's going to trickle down to working people, let's just give working Americans making $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year, or couples making twice that, more of a direct return on their taxes.
But as we said, this would cost $2.5 trillion. You've said that over a decade. You also want to raise the minimum wage. You want to see that raised $15 an hour. You've got other Democrats. Senator Warren wants a virtually free public college. He's talked about a federal daycare program. Beto O'Rourke is talking about a $5 trillion climate change plan, and on and on. A lot of this is popular, but voters are going to be asking, how do we pay for it?
Well, I can show you how to pay for it. I can't speak to other folks, but the pay fors for me are very obvious. Number one, you can start taxing capital gains as ordinary income. If a wealthy person buys a Picasso, sells it for $1 million, sells it for $10 million, they're paying less of that than somebody who goes out and sweats for their job as a janitor or in a factory. They should be taxed at the same rate. That alone is going to bring in well over $1 trillion more. Rolling back these toxic Trump tax cuts at the highest marginal incomes, moving back the capital gains tax to where it was in the crazy wild days of the Obama era can bring in over $1 trillion. So we can do things that we used to do in my grandparents' generation that expanded the middle class, making strategic investments and having a tax rate that is fair in terms of not blowing holes in our deficit, but actually creating more growth for everyone.
But is there a simple Democratic message, though? You've got President Trump saying, look, and this is if the economy stays where it is right now, economy is continuing to grow, we've got full employment, stock market's roaring. What's the Democrats' simple to understand answers?
Well, you're going to have 20 different people telling you what that is. And my simple answer is that we are at a point in our society where the indices of success that we're using don't speak to the average American. The stock market ticker or GDP numbers don't speak to people in my community. I live in a working class community that's struggling at the poverty line, where people who work full-time jobs still at my corner bodega use food stamps. You think they care what the stock market's doing today or what the GDP numbers? No. Donald Trump seems to have the answer to folks who have wealth, and I'm not demonizing people with wealth, but why are we gearing our tax code to help people with wealth get more wealth? We put $750 billion in our tax code, moving wealth up. And some of those things I defend and think are okay, like the mortgage interest deduction. But why aren't we starting to do things to make sure that people who work every day in America can have the American dream? And that's the problem that we have right now. And there seems to be a lack of empathy, a more courageous empathy is needed in our country to see the struggles of people from factory towns to farm towns to city towns who can't even afford the rent in their cities anymore because costs are going so high.
You do favor the Medicare for All plan introduced by Senator Sanders. In essence, it's single payer. It would, within 4 years, do away with virtually all private health insurance. Your state of New Jersey, just in November, elected new members of Congress, Democrats, heavily Republican districts. Do you think voters in those districts want to see their private health insurance go away?
Well, I'm a pragmatist. I ran a city and had to try to bend the cost curve of health care. The way we're doing it now doesn't work. Now, I say Medicare for all, but I'm also a person who's going to tell you in the next breath, we can't get there right away. We need to start showing first and foremost that we can create a viable public option just by reducing Medicare eligibility to 55. We were one vote away from doing that right before I came into the Senate. That alone would drive down costs. It would actually create lower costs for people that are in the private market because more older people would come into that public option. So there are really pragmatic steps we can take to accomplish our goals: expanding healthcare, lowering costs.
Few other things I want to ask you about. In your Justice for All plan, you've long worked on criminal justice issues. You want to give convicted felons the right to vote. As I'm sure you know, Senator Sanders has said they should not only have the right to vote when they're released from prison, they should have that right while they're incarcerated. Do you agree with him?
I just think that is a frustrating debate that we seem to now be having. As a guy who lives in an inner city black community and knows that there are millions of Americans that are being arrested and convicted and should never be there in the first, and not only lose their right to vote, but they lose their liberty. Let's get this conversation back to where it is right now. Our prison population in this country has gone up 500% since 1980 alone. We locked up more people for marijuana in 2017 than all the violent crimes combined. And so here we have a nation that takes away people's liberty and their right to vote for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. So if Bernie Sanders wants to get involved in the conversation about whether Dylann Roof and the marathon bomber should have the right to vote, my focus is liberating black and brown people and low-income people from prison, because we have a system in America, as Brian Stevenson says, it treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. My focus is tearing down the system of mass incarceration so that we don't even have to have the debate about people's voting rights because they're not going to prison in the first place. People that don't belong there are there, and I'm going to stop that as president.
Senator Cory Booker will be following you on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Eventually, the big test with Booker is going to come when his ties to major corporations and big tech companies and the Trumps are brought more into the spotlight. He needs to find a way to break out of the mold that he is old money, which technically he is because his parents are very wealthy, and is an Ivy League system Democrat. I think what it has come down to is, why did he compromise and go against his ethical compass for certain issues and not for others? Politics definitely is compromise, but for whom? His own self-interest? It seems to be looking upward and not around at who he has appealed to. He's got to find a way to branch out and seem relatable, not only to attract more donors, but also citizens on the right and the left to win this election. He can't strategize like Obama, because we are no longer in the age of Obama. We're in the age of sensationalism and mass appeal, with fame and having a brand being what keeps people engaged, especially when 20 other people are fighting you for the same nomination. I hope that this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listen, and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that the idea of progressivism and advocacy for our society improving aligns with the best possible political candidate for our next president. While every candidate may have a jaded past in some way, it doesn't negate them for being subjected to criticism and comment for how they choose to move forward in terms of policy making and who they'll choose as their constituents. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Lenico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French.